In this conversation, I interview Gab Columbro, the Executive Director at FINOS. FINOS.org, FINOS.org is a nonprofit part of the Linux Foundation that is managing the open source contributions for fintech platforms. So we talked about what open source is, how it works, how it's funded, how it's managed, the political influences of money in nonprofit, the bridge from Web 2 world of closed source software production to open source to then Web 3 and crypto, where there is open source by default. We basically chatted about how they're growing the business, the nonprofit. They're doing a few $1 million now in revenue. And we talked about what matters for them. Overall, I learned a ton about open source development and why it's important for the world today and the world in the future. So I hope you enjoy. Here is Gab Columbro. All right, Gab, I'm excited to be chatting with you, man. I love what you're working on at FINOS. Why don't we start there? Could you just tell me and for people listening what FINOS is and what you guys are trying to accomplish in the world?
Absolutely. But first of all, thanks for having me here, Mike. I'm excited to be able to share a little bit more about FINOS, the Linux Foundation, and myself. So, well, just quickly on high level, FINOS is the Fintech Open Source Foundation. We are a nonprofit, now part of the Linux Foundation, which is the largest shared investment in the world, technology investment in the world. And our mission has been for the last 4 years since we launched to drive open source collaboration in financial services. And that means across all the different constituents that make up this industry, whether it be investment banks, buy-side and asset managers, techs, big tech companies, consulting companies, and regulators. We really see open source and open standards as a mean to an end, really to drive innovation in an industry that really is in dire need of it, I would say. And, I come from very much of an open source background. And I've noticed how, there is a major opportunity for this industry to better collaborate, go past the sort of competitive nature and sort of regulated nature of the industry to innovate very much like we've seen in every other industry over the last 20 years through open collaboration.
And what's the general attitude now on companies like, say, Apple, Google, Microsoft, even like mid-sized companies? I'm thinking Slack, Airtable, companies in that range. How do they view open source? Because it seems to still be fairly split. I know Microsoft traditionally had been pretty closed off. Google famously open. Like, how open source is a strange concept, right? It's like put everything public online, and then like, can you talk to me a little bit about the trends of open source?
Absolutely. Well, I would start by saying that, as you say, when I started pitching banks, not even just banks, investment banks, the most conservative institutions in the world, about 5 years ago, that they should, take their intellectual property and put it in the open and collaborate with their competitors. Let's just say that the reaction was a little lukewarm 5 years ago. So there's been a lot of work to do. But the reality, if we sort of expand, to your point, the conversation to other industries, big tech. At this point, open source is basically established as the, not only the primary way to co-develop code that is non-competitive differentiating, meaning the likes of, as you say, Google, Amazon, Twitter, Facebook, they all have realized that especially when you're running a SaaS business and therefore you're selling a service, you're not selling software, oftentimes major building blocks of your offering are not necessarily your differentiating FE, are not your crown jewels. And therefore, it makes way more sense to actually collaborate on those, making them become de facto standard. I think examples like, Kubernetes or, Hadoop in terms of MapReduce and big data. These are major examples of open source software that got originated by these large tech companies because they actually see a strategic advantage in the longer term rather than having to maintain, a very expensive piece of software that is not necessarily differentiating. And so I think it's fair to say that if Mark Andreessen said that, software is eating the world, I think in 2022, open source is eating software. You mentioned Microsoft. Microsoft used to be probably the biggest hater of open source under the Baldmer, CEO, with the new CEO, not so new anymore, Satya. There's been a distinct switch. Microsoft is now the largest open source contributor in the world, both in terms of people and code. So talking about the switch in terms of perspective and feeling around open source.
Yeah. And how does this structure from a business perspective? So Microsoft clearly justifies an enormous expense of probably tens or hundreds of millions of dollars on open source development, for which any other competing company could take what they built and use for themselves. Are they getting ROI on other members outside of Microsoft contributing? And do you know the rough orders of magnitude, like how many people contribute to like the Linux Foundation or open source at Microsoft? Like where are we in terms of scale of open source projects?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I'll touch on the first part of your question. There's many ways that these companies get ROI out of open source. I think one that you mentioned is absolutely mutualizing the cost of maintenance of a piece of software, not just maintenance, but really feature development. And so that's clearly the most obvious one. And especially when you're talking about projects that are then incubated under foundations like ours, we do have a vested interest in growing the community of the project, supporting our members or our contributors in making those projects successful. So in a way, you have an ally in growing community on these projects. But the reality is that I think the major way these companies look at open source in many cases is also really as a business model, maybe less so from the largest, tech vendor, but really when you're talking startups and mid-size, especially here in the Silicon Valley, it is a very well-established go-to-market strategy to really leverage open source. Think about, your typical sort of funding process for a startup, especially in a competitive industry like financial services. You would really need a major upfront funding to be able to even stand out and get to the sort of initial stages where you're trying to compete in a very, very competitive and fragmented market. What open source, and especially the commercial open source business model enables, is for you to put out a piece of software that, if you're doing the right moves to nurture a community, can actually start engaging developers sort of on a bottoms up, on a try before you buy type basis, and ultimately really shortening the sales cycle because you're basically allowing them self-evaluation. You're allowing your champions to learn directly from the open source software, to become familiar with the software before even, having had to speak to a sales guy. And so we are seeing major potential across all industries. I mean, there's been massive exits besides, Red Hat and GitHub, of course, being acquired over the last 2 years. We are seeing more and more commercial open source companies, especially in SaaS. And we can talk a little bit more about how I think the SaaS business models connects to open source. But you have plenty of examples like Elasticsearch being listed, especially I would argue for smaller companies, open source should be considered as a very appealing go-to-market strategy business model, especially in such a complex economic and funding climate.
And do you think the open source projects, by definition, kind of climb the stack? Like I think of early open source projects as Linux, maybe even like operating on the kernel, or you have like PHP, or you have the protocols, the languages, the building blocks, so to speak. Those are like, you're not going to make money off of that. So everyone says, let's work on this together. We make this operating system so that we each benefit, right? You can have competing companies each contributing and each benefit from that. But then it's like, you don't need to know what operating system your Mac uses to have a great time on the Mac. And it's not core, as you're saying, it's not core to the intellectual property that Apple's building in this case. Does this kind of trajectory climb the stack all the way? Is this the right way to think about it? Like it's increasingly higher and higher up the chain of software development? Or how do you think about the patterns of it?
I think you made two outstanding points. The first one being, absolutely, we have seen open source starting from the lower layers of the infrastructure. Think about Linux, think about even Kubernetes, think about Node. It's most often something associated to again, either layers down and deep in the stack that, to your point, are not your competitive differentiator, are not your sales sort of differentiator, but it also does very much connect. And I think that's where you're going in terms of going up the stack to what your business model is. I would argue that many of these projects, regardless of the layer where they are in the stack, don't give you the full end-to-end package solution that typically an enterprise buyer would need. They probably will get you 80% the way there, especially if you're, say, hosting, think about a fintech companies or a payment solution that is actually a platform play as opposed to a solution play. Let's think about an open banking, for example, application. Well, we all think that there should be a lot of value in creating common, standards, APIs, and even reference implementation for, say, exposing your internal core banking through open banking. That said, the way you're going to make money is actually by hosting that software and offering a service to your customers that you then bill on a, say, per user or per transaction that really completely disconnects from the actual, old way of licensing software, if that makes sense. And so I think you're absolutely right. We are seeing open source eating, in a way, more and more the layers of the stack up to the level of APIs. I certainly have seen some attempts. We certainly in FINOS have projects like Perspective, where you have also nice componentized UI libraries that you can use, but you're never going to get sort of the full end product, because that's where typically companies come in. And to your point, while we're all collaborating on the same core, we can add those enterprise features, those just even like hosting and servicing your customer. I think that's the fine point that I'm trying to make here is when I was growing up in open source in the early 2000s, open source was actually a commercial differentiator. We could actually say what I was selling, hey, we are X, but open source. And that would be an actual differentiator. I would argue that in most industries nowadays, open source is more like table stakes. To your point, my Mac runs on hundreds of open source components, and I don't even know that they exist. Unless I go and look at the fine print in my Apple license terms and so on and so forth. So it's really more about how you drive and contribute to open source in a strategic way for your business model. I want to be very clear. Many of these banks that participate in FINOS, actually all of the constituents in these communities, they don't do it for charity. Open source is not because of the good of the world. Let's be clear. I certainly have a conscience aspect of freedom of information that does sort of keep me attached to this world. But the reality is that open source has this unique power of allowing you as an individual contributor, as a corporate contributor, or a company that is trying to, sell a technology-centric business, to actually do something that is good for you and for your business, while actually driving the overall betterment of the ecosystem, because you're ultimately contributing intellectual property that becomes sort of collective value that other folks can use. So I just want to, sometimes open source is reduced to either just a code sharing mechanism, or to many millennials come into the workforce and ask for, what are you doing for good? And, sure, open source helps, but let's be clear, it's primarily a very efficient way to bring your solution to market.
And how about the politics of it? I'm curious, like, say, take the Linux, which is a large foundation.
Yep.
I'm curious how many people participate in Linux, and then how do decisions, I would imagine, get made, right? Because it's kind of a community building a product. So how does that all kind of tactically work?
It's a very, very good question. Well, first of all, the Linux Foundation is actually an umbrella of multiple foundations. So let's start there. FINOS being sort of the financial services vertical. Of course, the Linux kernel community is another very famous foundation. The Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which hosts Kubernetes, Argo, and most of the sort of cloud native technology, is under the Linux Foundation. So first thing to understand is that there's very sort of independent entities actually operating under the Linux Foundation. Then the general answer to your question, and this characterizes really any open source community, is transparency. all the decisions that are made in open source communities, especially when it's under the auspices of a foundation, whether it be the Linux Foundation or any of the sub-foundations like FINOS, have to happen based on a transparent governance that is publicly documented. Generally, you try to operate by consensus first. I mean, there is rarely sort of split votes that happen either at board level or at any of the sort of project level. But it does happen. And so you do have very clear guidelines of how to resolve disputes. Up front, it's very clear who is entitled to vote, what is the majority, what is the quorum, and so on and so forth. So I think the first thing to understand is that open source communities are not governed top down, meaning we do have a board of directors, and that is very much sort of a reflection of the paying, contributing members to the foundation. The reality is that this board doesn't control the underlying dynamics of all the different projects. Each project is in a way very much self-governed based on duocracy, really. It's governance by contribution. The more you contribute, the more you have a say in the direction of the project. Now, that's how it works on paper. Of course, as you say, the more you build projects that have a direct value on either the bottom line or the actual go-to-market of a commercial company, well, politics is going to start to kick in, and there will be disputes that need to be resolved. And so there are also, escalation points and escalation procedures at any level to make sure that these disputes can be resolved. But I think, if I need to sort of dumb it down, transparency, meritocracy, and making sure that this is not a pyramidal, sort of top-down, pay-to-play type of organization. That's what we've seen sort of in the long term is able to really build trust. And ultimately, when folks trust each other, it's much easier to get to consensus.
And in the case of Linux, roughly how many people are participating?
Yeah, so you asked that question a couple of times. I would have to pull up my numbers, but actually in the Linux Foundation at large, I think we're talking millions of developers.
Really? Millions.
If you're talking between the maintainers and the contributors, I mean, look, the Linux Foundation hosts over 300 projects. Many of, basically we spin up a project every week. In 2 weeks, we're going to have our open source summit. Actually, next week, we're going to have our open source summit in Dublin. There's going to be some pretty amazing announcements in terms of new projects. So, the Linux Foundation is really become the place of choice for open source collaboration. Yet every day, both sort of individual contributors bringing projects to potentially incubate in the Linux Foundation, as well as actually major companies trying to really, harmonize an ecosystem, create a brand new way of doing business. I mean, if you think about the big data world and the Hadoop, at the open source project that is hosted in Apache, well, that created a whole new ecosystem 10 years ago when sort of big data wasn't a thing. By really having, Cloudera, Mapr, and Hortonworks collaborating on the same piece of software. What the Linux Foundation really has done an amazing job at is identifying these opportunities and create the initial consensus and funding for these projects to actually succeed. So it's staggering numbers. I can come back with you with more detail.
Yeah. No, you're just even in the ballpark of 1 million is where I was curious. That's staggering. And how do the economics work? So I'm picturing, there's probably people obviously there's people who are getting salaries from companies to spend all day, every day building on open source. Yeah. Then there are people, I'm picturing there are just hobbyists who on the weekend, they just love tinkering and they're going to go in. They may not even be getting paid. What's the general composition of contributors look like? Is it 95% company salary folks, or is it, how does that work?
It's a really fundamental question, and one that the open source community continues to grapple with as, as more and more sort of commercial dynamics sort of are created around open source, in the sense that Look, I'll start with an example. Last year in December, we had a major vulnerability, which you probably have heard, called Log4Shell. It was a major security vulnerability on a very widely used package called Log4j that has caused, months of remediation in the largest enterprises in the world, as well as, the White House calling up on the Linux Foundation to corral a task force that will start looking at addressing, global open source security. Now, the security of open source software is only a factor of a function of how healthy an open source project is and how sustainable an open source project is. There's a very funny XKCD comics about, this Log4j issue or of sort of related issues whereby, it shows the whole world infrastructure relying on a really small, tiny piece maintained from a random guy in Nebraska.
Yeah.
And that is exactly the issue that the open source community at large, the Linux Foundation, other foundations, global governments, both at at the White House, at the EU level, are trying to figure out. Because to your point, there is still a major disbalance between those who actually maintain the code and how they're compensated from. I would say, for the largest projects in the world, especially the ones that are hosted under foundations like us, I will say that the vast majority of the maintainers is actually paid by their employer on a day-by-day for, 50 to 100% to actually work on open source projects. And that, of course, is a sustainable model because those companies are making money out of open source and they do reinvest either by funding foundations like, through membership or providing sweat equity, actually, developers that help us maintain our projects. Those are the two sort of fundamental ways that when a project is under a foundation, you can contribute to. That said, there's a huge long tail of projects, especially in ecosystems like NPM, for example, whereby you have these really small libraries that basically the whole world is depending on, that are maintained either by, a couple of developers or maybe many developers, but that are not funded for it. And to your point, they've been maintaining it as a passion. Earlier in 2022, there's been a pretty noticeable, a pretty famous situation where a disgruntled NPM developer pulled a couple of packages, I think it was called Faker and Colors, from the NPM repository, so from the central library repository, and that started breaking builds all over the world. And the reason why the guy pulled it down is because, he wasn't getting paid for them. So I think, to your point, especially when projects are under foundations, I think the Linux Foundation has done a massive job in funneling corporate funding into open source projects and sort of maintainers, but a huge focus this year, not just for the Linux Foundation, but really, for the whole open source community out there, is to better engage with corporates and with regulators and with policymakers in the understanding that open source powers critical infrastructure, that there's actually potential national security threats here, and that we all have a role to play to sustain open source, whether it be through funding foundations, whether it be through putting sweat equity and developers on these projects and paying for them, whether it is through direct to maintainer grants, GitHub, Patreon, Tidelift. There's multiple, startups that actually allow you to fund directly a maintainer of an open source project without actually employing them. So big topic here. Right. The sort of big Pandora's box, I think that you opened up here.
Yeah, interesting. So I would imagine that companies. So if I'm a developer and I want to work on software, I can go to a company and I can work on open source software, get paid a salary, and then have that company sort of make the decision as to how much they want to invest. And it's kind of an interesting equation, right? It's like in most cases, when companies hire developers, there's like product roadmap. The more developers we spend, the more faster we build. And so it's like the equation is simpler. But if I'm building an open source software, if I'm, Microsoft allocating thousands of people, if I'm building something that I'm benefiting from, but other companies are benefiting from, then, just like any shared resources, I'm incentivized to get more than I put in. So I want Apple to throw in their developers. I want Google to throw in their developers. And I would imagine that sort of stuff happens. What's the purpose of the foundation? So I could imagine that open source software exists, companies are funding it, they're building it together. What do foundations serve that we need as a society that couldn't exist otherwise?
I of course will be biased in my answer.
Sure.
As the executive director of a foundation, but there's a couple of layers to that answer. I think the first layer is, first and foremost, foundations are a third-party container of intellectual property. So think about it as the commons. We are creating a neutral, independent environment where intellectual property can be put in and pulled out in an IP clean way, to be sort of oversimplifying here, and also to disintermediate any of the contributors and participants, in the sense that, we have a transparent governance, anyone can join, so anyone can have a seat at the table of the foundation, but none of the contributors or consumers have full control over the project, which gets me to the second point, which is not only, we help making sure that all the contributors and all the consumers have the right agreements from an intellectual property standpoint to prevent, issues down the line, to prevent someone from suing you down the line. And of course, to defend the project itself in case there are, trademark or IP claims coming from sort of the broader community. But that brings it to the second point, which is actually making sure, going back to that level playing field and the transparent governance that we were discussing before, making sure that, the average Joe contributing to an open source project has indeed the same rights on that project that, say, a large corporation. Of course, we can talk about membership and what are the benefits of not only contributing, but becoming a member, a paying corporate member of these foundations. But besides that, when it comes to collaborating on the code, everyone should have the same rights. The only thing that drives more influence is more contribution, whether that be, Microsoft, or whether that be, Josh Mo in Nebraska, as we were saying before. And so not only IP, but also transparent governance and making sure that it's actually a welcoming and level playing field for every organization. Again, not just in terms of decision, but also in terms of policies. Think about, we work in a very regulated industry. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan and Citi and Morgan Stanley, they would never be in the same room if we didn't have a very strong antitrust policy, conflict of interest policy, and the FINOS team would, in a way, police those interactions to make sure that they are always along sort of according to policies. And then the third thing that is more proactive, it's really, we have a vested interest in ensuring the sustainability of the project and the long-term longevity of the project. So as I was saying before, we are an ally to the maintainers to grow adoption of the project. And that means, marketing, engagement, producing proper documentation, creating what we call an on-ramp that is as sort of frictionless as possible. And of course, growing contributions, because to your point before, it's like, let's put this software out there and then the community is going to come and then contributors are going to come. Well, that's not really how it works. To your point, there is also a sort of a chicken and egg problem where, I'm going to start contributing once that other entity starts contributing, once we see that initial step. And so, foundations help in a way breaking this deadlock and making sure that we can actually make incremental progress, as well as, give the best chances to the project to succeed from a funding standpoint, from a promotion standpoint, from a legal standpoint, in terms of also protecting it from protecting the trademark, which is really the primary asset that is owned by a foundation like us. I think that's in closing, an important point. Foundations like us don't own the intellectual property that we develop. The intellectual property is open source, is under an open source license. What we do own is indeed the trademark to that project, so that we can enforce the trademark and defend the project when, People are saying, hey, I'm compatible with Kubernetes or I'm compatible with Linux. Well, we're really the steward of the project as a whole.
So I imagine being 501c3 nonprofit is critical. You can have a foundation that's not nonprofit. What are the metrics that you care about? Do you care about like revenue from donations of these sponsor companies, or what are the, like, when you wake up on Monday morning and you're like, okay, guys, we got to make this progress. What are the metrics you're looking at, and where are you on these metrics?
That's a very good question. So the general answer is that, of course, the metrics sort of depend on the stage of the life cycle that you are as a foundation. But let me start from sort of the first point. Yes, absolutely. All foundations are nonprofits, are either 501c3, as you say, charities, or 501c6. So business leagues, trade associations. In fact, the Linux Foundation is a 501c6. FINOS, when we were an independent company before joining the Linux Foundation, we were a 501c6. And as you say, absolutely, most of these organizations are actually membership organizations, non-profit organizations. That said, revenue, it's not our primary metric, but it is certainly a great lagging indicator of satisfaction of our members. So maybe it's worth spending 1 second on sort of the funding and sort of business models. As I said, this is not a pay to play. Anyone, as this is open source, can consume or contribute to our projects. That said, as a member, as a paying member, we have a set of membership tiers, platinum, gold, silver, with different benefits. But you get, of course, a higher influence at board level. So depending on the tier, you have different sort of access to the board. And of course, a bunch of sort of additional services that we provide that are not in any way sort of hampering that sort of transparent community collaboration, but gives you sort of added value, first mover advantage, sort of early access to information and that type of stuff. Now, in terms of metrics, of course, revenue is an important one. And we're now looking at, again, this is public data, so I'm not sharing anything private here, but FINOS is about a $3.5 million foundation. And we certainly see that number as a good indicator of our growth. We're seeing, over the last years, we signed up probably 30 members. We're now at 59. It's growing fast across, not only capital markets, but we're starting to get retail banks. We now have asset management and buy-side firms like Wellington and Point72. We're seeing more and more fintechs coming in, cloud service providers. Clearly there is, this is such a complex workflow that there's value to be gained for all the different constituencies that are part of that workflow. But when I look at, can I go back to your question of metrics? Besides, money and revenue, the ultimate metric is actually adoption. The ultimate metric is the ROI that you get out of open source. And to your point before, it's not as easy to calculate the multiplier of investing in an open source foundation or investing in, contributing to an open source project, as opposed to a much clearer sort of internal model of developing software. That said, especially in an industry like financial services, we are putting a lot of effort into trying to quantify ROI, not only at, to your point, cost saving level, but also at talent acquisition and retention level. Open source is a huge way of nurturing a more open ecosystem of talent, especially in financial service institutions that are in a major sort of talent crunch right now. Yes, there's no unique model to measure ROI of open source. I think it's very much dependent of the specific project and of the specific foundation that you're working in. But ideally, the ROI that the industry, and of course, particularly our members, is getting out of open source is ultimately the metric that I care about. One sort of very direct proxy for that is adoption. It's literally how many people are actually downloading our projects because they're making use of it. And so we are more and more tracking, whilst earlier in our stage, sort of earlier in our life cycle, when we were trying to build our community, we had more metrics around contribution and sort of how many new projects or how many new contributors are entering our community. Right now, as we have over 50 projects and we're more mature, it's less so about continuing to bring in projects and more so about seeing this upward trend in adoption of our projects. And so then down the line, there's case studies and success stories able to actually surface this adoption into, production use cases. This is going to be a big focus of our conference in December, the Open Source and Finance Forum.
Interesting. It's almost like crypto and Web3 have taken, I almost look at open source and what you're doing as like the bridge between Web2 mentality and Web3, where you have this governance model, your nonprofit, you have these different levels that people can buy into and contribute to the project. Yep. It's open source in the sense that anyone anywhere can contribute. And then it's like QA is done internally. So people obviously can't like submit viruses or, major flaws. So I almost think like Web3 feels like open source by default. It's like root level contribution, root level foundational building is open source. Yep. And obviously the protocols themselves are just that's the piece of it that is the magic aspect of it. Like blockchain operating on everyone's different node makes it so that it gives us the properties that we get excited about. Do you see foundations existing? I mean, foundations exist today in Web3 where a group of people start an LLC, for-profit company. They raise money from investors. Investors usually buy ownership in the tokens, although sometimes they buy ownership in the LLC, and they get some discount on the tokens. The tokens are launched, pre-sale, sale, everyone buys into the tokens. So now you have all this money that goes somewhere. So then they create a foundation, a nonprofit that owns the decision-making on how to allocate that money to grow the protocol. And eventually people say, we want to dissolve the LLC. It's like LLC is the spark plug that starts the engine. And then we get rid of the spark plug. So I almost see when I've talked to founders, they sometimes will, when they're honest, express a frustration in the challenge of how do you allocate money to actually grow the protocol? And what kind of the first wave of doing this, and I'm curious to get your feedback on it because it's something that like crypto seems to universally struggle with, is like when you have a, large project, Solana or Ethereum being a very, very large one, but even some of the smaller ones, they're managing sometimes tens of millions of dollars. They give money to developers who submit grant proposals to build apps on top of the protocol. So the success of the protocol is determined by how many app developers build on top of that protocol and then how many people use those apps. So it's like, you're kind of like, what do you do? How is money best useful? And the problem is that oftentimes developers will just submit proposals for grants to every project. They get money from everyone, and then they go to the beach and drink Kool-Aid, or maybe they like half-ass some projects. It's like, it's not a genuine proposal to actually, it's not working is my point. It's like, we're giving money to developers. They're kind of, it's a little bit of a show and tell, and then the money just dissolves and like apps don't get built on it. And we're kind of in this place now, early September, 2022, of like the crypto market is not like, we have these protocols and there's a couple apps here and there, but it's not really like in high gear. And I almost view the foundation's work is to somehow better allocate money. So I'll pause there and let you reflect on what you've learned and how you sort of see maybe words of wisdom on going forward with these foundations in crypto.
Man, I feel like this subject that you brought up maybe warrants a whole other hour of conversation, because I gotta say, we started FINOS in its sort of previous embodiment called the Symphony Software Foundation in 2016. And that was really just pre sort of ICO and one of our now sister foundations, Hyperledger, which is very much focused on blockchain, started very much at the same time. And I've seen them, I was so envious in the first year for how quickly they were growing. And I started really toying with this idea of, you're absolutely right. I've said multiple times that the blockchain ecosystem, the Web3 ecosystem is actually open source by default, despite, of course, there are valid attempts to private blockchains or even closed source blockchains, think about Ripple as a sort of, I think, a main example. Generally, all the way from Bitcoin, Web3 is open source. What it's not, I think, is, and that's my hypothesis, it's not openly governed necessarily. The fact one of my pet peeves at the beginning. I'm like, well, why is every single coin standing up their own foundation? And to your point, it is more about the disbursement of money and operating the network than necessarily about hosting the code. So it's important to make this differentiation. Foundations like us are primarily about sort of managing the static part of the code, meaning the code itself, who has access to it, who can download it, the IP, and, sort of resolving disputes, which to an extent prevent forks. If Bitcoin was under a foundation, maybe we wouldn't have forks every 6 months, sort of as an example. That said, what you're talking about, like foundations to actually operate networks in a more sustainable, in a more openly governed way, I think there's a huge potential there. And there's a huge potential for not reinventing the wheel, because let's be honest, it is hard to stand up the foundation and it's not easy to get it right. In fact, the Linux Foundation 2 years ago launched a new concept of foundation called governance networks. So it's really a blueprint, not necessarily to manage code as much it is a blueprint to manage a production decentralized network. So it was really designed with the idea in mind to actually, provide support for many of these, coins, blockchains, tokens, and creating, again, an ecosystem whereby, to your point, not just the allocation, but also how do we engage and reward developers, and how do folks have a specific role in standing up a node and in the network, could be managed in a more centralized way. And again, we might start a whole religious conversation here, whether it should be a DAO or a centralized organization to actually manage the development and operation of a decentralized network. But I absolutely agree that there's a lot of potential there. And it's one of my sort of major, I think, pet peeves. We think that we can help some of these organizations that, yes, sort of some of these projects that actually do start open source, but not have sort of a clear open governance from the get-go, raises eyebrows and sort of creates actual friction in the adoption and the trust that people can build on that project. I want to close on one point. You sort of touched as potential, also sort of as open source as a sort of bridge from Web 2 to Web 3. I honestly couldn't agree more. There's a very interesting article from Angela Strange, a partner at Andreessen Horowitz from, I think it was earlier this year or late last year. He's talking about how open source is coming finally to financial services. So I'm glad to see the VCs also waking up to this idea that there's a huge potential for open source, for fintechs, sort of jumping into sort of the commercial open source bandwagon. The reason why I mention it is I think her vision was compelling to me, as she's basically saying, look, we're moving from, first generation mainframes, second generation sort of siloed SaaS, sort of Web 2 type platforms. Next generation is actually having open source components that are sort of these basic primitives that can be combined and can be put together to really create a new financial system. What she's basically saying is that this could be a bridge between sort of the legacy world of banks into actually the world of fintechs. And so, again, I couldn't agree more that I think open source has a major potential to bridge, legacy and fintech, Web 2 and Web 3. We really have to start consolidating a little bit. Otherwise, we're going to move from a siloed, centralized mess to a completely decentralized mess where you really need point-to-point integrations. And that's not going to be better for end users, ultimately.
Yeah. It almost seems like you're really embodying a lot of the characteristics of the on-chain governance mechanisms. You have these different, like you can buy into different levels of contribution on the board. Well, how it happens on a DAO is like the more tokens you hold, the more votes you have. So it's the same concept. And then there's like, okay, you guys have, $3 or $4 million coming in every year. How do you spend that? I would imagine you're thinking about people. You're thinking about, we need a person to do this, a person to do this. You're not building a product per se. So you're really, I would imagine you're agreeing, is like you're spending it on people to solve specific problems for the foundation. The,
Yes.
I think there's kind of an open question mark is like, what do people who are running foundations or, leading contributors to foundations, how do they spend that money? Do they just keep it in a reserve? Like, how should they give it out in grants? I don't know. I mean, so you guys would not give money to, do you guys give money to developers to build, or is that pretty much all, volunteers and companies sponsored? Do you think that model works?
Very good question.
Yeah.
Very good question. And not, I think sort of the answer to the question has some quote unquote religious connotations, meaning some open source fundamentalist. And maybe that was me a few years ago. I had dreadlocks. I as much as I say I'm not an open source hippie, I definitely used to be one. But the reality is that yes, some will tell you that if you are paying the developers, then it's not really open source. The reality is that, as we were discussing before, we are here to make sure that the ecosystem can be sustainable. And we will do whatever it takes. Again, assuming that there is interest on the project and assuming that there is adoption of that project. We want to make sure that all our downstream consumers, yes, it's not a product. I don't offer commercial support for my projects. That's, I think, the fundamental difference. That said, the ethos and the desire to see our adopters, championing our projects and showing off how they're using and the ROI that they're getting, it's really sort of back to the metrics, sort of our ultimate goal. And so we do, in certain cases, fund specific developments. And there are different ways we can do that. I have certainly a discretionary funding that I've agreed with the board, about $200K that I can spend throughout the year on specific sort of project augmentation initiatives. But the Linux Foundation actually has a crowdfunding platform that you can easily create those initiatives. You can have even people sort of chime in outside of what FINOS can sort of put in there from our operating budget. So we do, as much as you have to be, of course, be careful not to sort of pick and choose, not to pick winners. But yes, we do definitely accelerate strategic developments when it's something that actually delivers value to the whole ecosystem. I'll make you an example. One of our main standards is called FDC3. It's about interoperability on the trader's desktop and across buy side and sell side. And it's an open standard. So there wasn't yet an open source piece of code implementing it. We're now building a conformance framework to make sure that anyone that says that it's compatible with the standard is indeed compatible with the standard. And that, if you think about it, is more of an offering that FINOS as a foundation is building than necessarily, an open source thing. And yes, so we actually took some money, have invested it on a consulting company that is building this conformance framework for us. That said, that is also built in the open because, we're not gonna become the arbiters. Ultimately, the maintainers of the project need to see themselves that this is a good conformance framework, but yes, we are paying for developing it. And I do think that increasingly we're going to see more and more of this as, the industry and the technology industry at large grapple with the sustainability problem. In fact, I do think to the previous conversation that I think sort of Web3 and these open source projects have something to learn from the experience of foundations like us. I think we have something to learn in terms of, to your point, how do you more effectively disburse money? There's part of me that says, well, it should be a complete DAO. Who am I or who is the board, to better allocate that money? There might be a better sort of community-driven way to do so. And so I really look forward to a potentially sort of two-way learning process here.
Yeah, the one thing I think Web3 has that traditional Web2 nonprofit open source projects wouldn't have is the element of trust. Like on a DAO, there's no trust. Like I don't need to believe the board members are operate. It's like I vote and then I see my vote and I see everyone else's vote and I know that there's a foundational technological framework that I trust. And if you trust that, then all that matters is like, do the people carry out the orders of the vote? Like there's definitely, that's always the off-chain, on-chain world, but at least there's that. And I don't know, I have no clue. And I bet it's hard for you to even determine like how much backdooring kind of shadow moving money is operating in open. I'm sure it happens, right? Like humans are humans. But when you move to like tokenized voting governance first, it at least removes the potential for that to happen. So I don't know, maybe that's the future in some way.
Oh, don't get me wrong. I much rather deal with computers than with you. Don't get me wrong. Like, humans, we are the problem.
Yeah.
But look, I think it does depend on the maturity. It goes back to sort of the maturity. Look, when we started 5 years ago, you can just imagine this, the 12 largest investment banks in the room. You know, I was caught in the crossfire of what's this bank doing? And I was like, dude, that's literally what I'm not supposed to tell you. Like, I'm a trust, like you touched on trust. And there's no doubt in my mind that trust is the most important,
what you're selling.
most important currency that I have.
Right.
But I had to build it.
Right.
And so, you know, it would be nice to live in a zero trust world, but I also do believe that it takes, you know, mature folks. And so there might be, you know, a time where the sort of personal touch can help unlock certain conversation. You actually can align drivers. I really, as a foundation chief executive, I see myself as a sort of a chief aligner of forces and drivers, in the sense that, you know, two companies might be competing, but if you break down sort of the components, well, there might be a part that is sort of going in the same direction. And that's what my job is, to identify that part, sort of amplify it, and see if we can sort of make a collaboration happen. And some of this maybe can't just happen yet on a fully sort of tech-driven zero trust way.
Yeah. Gab, super interesting. I really enjoyed hearing your story. Where are you online? Are you on Twitter, writing on Medium or somewhere? And then also tell me, are there any people in particular or books that have inspired you along your journey?
Yes. Well, so I am available on Twitter at Mind the Gab. Actually, Mind the Gabs is my Twitter. So think about Mind the Gap. Just change a B for a P. And add the Z. I'm available on GitHub at Mind the Gap. You can find me on LinkedIn. And most of my writing is actually on the FINOS blog. So finos.org/blog would be the best place to follow me. Actually, next week I'll be in Dublin for the Open Source Summit in Europe. There's going to be a sort of a big announcement regarding sort of my future. So stay tuned there. In terms of who has massively influenced me, you know, I could mention a lot of folks, but I think Noam Chomsky is one of the main ones. I studied computer engineering, and when I was, you know, studying language theory, it was the first time that I sort of came across Noam Chomsky. And, you know, it as I was studying, you know, in a very sort of geek, you know, faculty, well, I started realizing that Chomsky had written the very same language theory actually for languages, for spoken languages. And it just really occurred to me, like, how this, you know, there are people that just really can cross disciplines and cross boundaries and having a major impact. Again, not just on something so geek, so left-brained as I'm used to, but they actually kind of span across, you know, the whole sort of, I'd say, range of disciplines and subjects and cultures. So he certainly has been one that has really motivated me to, you know, try to make an impact beyond just the technical nature of what we do. And in terms of books, not sure if necessarily has influenced me directly, but 1984 from George Orwell is one of my favorite books. Definitely hasn't influenced me how I run the foundation. Nobody likes a big brother, but it is certainly to me a really interesting reminder of, you know, people dynamics and, you know, how quickly things can go south, you know, if you don't sort of build that trust that we were talking about.
Yeah. Amazing how influential that book is. I read it recently as well, and it seems to just be so in the front of collective global consciousness for a reason.
Yeah.
With great power.
50 years later or 60 years later. I think that was, maybe 80 at this point.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think it was written in the 30s or 40s.
Yeah, 30 to 40.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fascinating, Gab. Well, congrats on all the progress, man. And hope to have you back on someday.
Thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciated the conversation.
Of course, man. See ya.